Imagine arriving in a foreign country to settle a family argument and accidentally starting a war. Have you ever watched someone make a bad decision and then immediately make 5 worse ones? Welcome to Alexandria. And so, Julius Caesar came to Egypt expecting politics. Egypt responded with a nervous breakdown, which honestly is one of the most Egyptian court things that could have happened at this point. Because Caesar has now met Cleopatra. Cleopatra has Caesar's attention. And Ptolemy XIII's faction has just realized their carefully designed plan has failed so badly, it deserves its own monument. Before we continue into the part where Egypt's royal family turns one awkward meeting into an international disaster, take 1 second to subscribe, like the video, and click the bell. It costs nothing, supports the channel, and unlike most decisions in this episode, it probably won't start a civil war. Excellent. Already more competent than Ptolemy's advisors. Imagine a royal family group chat. Cleopatra has been removed. Ptolemy XIII has been promoted to main character by a group of adults who absolutely should not be trusted with sharp objects. Rome has entered the chat. Pompey has left the chat permanently. Caesar has joined the chat, and now Cleopatra had just snuck into Caesar's room. Which sounds dramatic, until you realize that was actually the calm part. Because now she had to convince the most dangerous Roman alive that Egypt's royal family crisis was worth his time, his soldiers, his reputation, and possibly his ability to leave Alexandria without being turned into a decorative corpse. A normal person might call this risky. Cleopatra apparently called it Tuesday. And Caesar? Caesar looked at this beautiful disaster of a kingdom, the murdered rival, the teenage king, the exiled queen, the unpaid debts, the screaming advisors, the unstable city, and somehow decided, yes, I should personally involve myself. Because apparently, Rome had conquered many things, but not common sense. Cleopatra's plan worked. That was the problem. She reached Caesar. She got his attention. She forced herself back into the political conversation. And for one brief, shining moment, it looked like she had solved the problem. Unfortunately, ancient history has a strict policy. Every solved problem must immediately create 3 worse problems, 2 betrayals, 1 siege, and at least 1 sibling with a competing claim to the throne. So Cleopatra's secret entrance did not end the crisis. It upgraded it. From palace drama to civil war to Julius Caesar is now trapped in Alexandria. Whew. Excellent progress. No notes. Poor Ptolemy XIII is about to learn a very painful lesson. Being king does not mean you control the room, especially when Julius Caesar is standing in it. And once Rome enters your domestic crisis, congratulations, your crisis has been upgraded. Now it comes with soldiers, debt, legal claims, and 1 Roman general confidently acting like your country is a problem on his desk. And now we need to talk about Caesar, because Cleopatra's gamble only mattered if Caesar had a reason to care. And unfortunately for everyone who enjoyed stability, Caesar had several. He had arrived in Egypt after chasing Pompey, his great Roman rival, across the Mediterranean. And when he got there, Pompey was already dead. Not defeated in a grand final battle. Not captured in a dramatic Roman showdown. Dead. Murdered before Caesar could even finish the Civil War paperwork. Which was awkward. Because Caesar had come to Egypt expecting the final act of 1 Roman crisis. Instead, he found Pompey's severed head, a teenage king, an exiled queen, unpaid royal debts, a court full of schemers, and a city that looked 1 bad rumor away from becoming a very decorative riot. So, not exactly a relaxing diplomatic visit. More like opening the door to a hotel room and discovering the previous guests left behind a corpse, a civil war, and an invoice. And Egypt was not just any kingdom. Egypt mattered. It had grain. It had money. It had ports. It had strategic value. It had a royal family that apparently believed succession planning should be handled like a knife fight in a jewelry store. For Rome, Egypt was too important to ignore. And for Caesar personally, Egypt had another charming feature: debt. Ptolemy XII, Cleopatra's father, also known as the king who had spent years clinging to power with the financial grace of a drunk man buying loyalty on credit, had owed Rome a great deal. And now Caesar was standing in Alexandria, looking at his options. Option 1. Leave Egypt alone and hope this unstable royal family somehow solves its own problems, which would require optimism, prayer, and a complete misunderstanding of the Ptolemies. Option 2. Step in, impose order, collect what Rome was owed, and make sure Egypt did not turn into a hostile mess right next to Roman interests. Naturally, Caesar chose option 2, because Caesar did not look at unstable political situations and think, maybe I should stay out of this. No. Caesar looked at unstable political situations and thought, excellent, a new room where I can be the most important person. This was not random. This was how power worked. Rome did not need to officially annex Egypt to dominate it. Not yet. All Rome needed was influence. Recognition, debt pressure, a friendly ruler, a dependent dynasty, the gentle, loving hand of Roman supervision resting on your shoulder while slowly cutting off your oxygen. So Caesar had reasons to involve himself. And now, thanks to Cleopatra's surprise appearance, he had a very interesting political option standing right in front of him. Because Cleopatra was not just pleading for help. She was offering Caesar a way to solve Egypt on Roman terms. Or at least, that is probably how Caesar saw it. A divided royal house? Convenient. A young king controlled by advisors? Annoying. An intelligent, exiled queen looking for recognition? Useful. A kingdom that owed Rome money? Extremely motivating. Caesar did not need to be madly in love to see the opportunity. He just needed eyes. And ambition. And Caesar had both in extremely dangerous quantities. From Caesar's perspective, supporting Cleopatra, or at least forcing her back into the settlement, could weaken Ptolemy's faction, restore some version of order, and remind everyone in Alexandria that Rome was not a guest. Rome was the person at the table deciding who got to keep their chair, which, as you can imagine, was going to be received with complete calm and maturity by Ptolemy's advisors. Obviously, nothing says stable monarchy like a foreign general walking into your succession crisis and saying, "I'll handle this." And that is the problem. Caesar may have thought he was bringing order, but Egypt did not need a referee. Egypt needed an exorcist. Because the moment Caesar took Cleopatra seriously, he was no longer just visiting Egypt. He was choosing a side in a royal conflict where every side had enemies, armies, debts, wounded pride, and the emotional discipline of a crocodile in a jewelry shop. The moment Caesar starts examining Egypt's succession dispute, he discovers a small but important detail. There is already a legal solution. Years earlier, Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII Auletes, yes, the flute-playing king who somehow managed to lose and regain an entire kingdom, had left a will, and according to that will, Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII were supposed to rule together. Now let's pause for a second, because if you've watched everything that's happened so far, the phrase "rule together" should sound deeply optimistic. This family couldn't share a dinner table. Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII were not two calm colleagues disagreeing over office supplies. They were rival claimants in a kingdom where family disagreement could mean exile, murder, civil war, or all three if the palace schedule was open. The idea that they were going to successfully co-govern one of the richest kingdoms in the Mediterranean is almost adorable. This was not conflict resolution. This was giving a crocodile and a cat joint custody of a chicken. For Cleopatra, the message was clear. She was no longer outside the game. She was returning with Roman interest attached to her, like a very expensive, very dangerous security badge. For Ptolemy's faction, the message was even clearer. Their game had just been interrupted by Rome. Cleopatra appeared next to Caesar like a system error in their coup software. Imagine spending months building a perfect little power structure around a young king, only for Cleopatra to walk back in and Rome to say, "Restore previous version?" Deeply inconvenient. If Cleopatra regained formal recognition, what happened to the advisors who helped exclude her? What happened to the people who built their power around Ptolemy? What happened to the court faction that treated Cleopatra like a problem already solved? Nothing good. History rarely rewards people who almost erase a queen and then politely welcome her back. There is no, sorry about the exile, fruit basket large enough for that situation. Ptolemy's faction did not hear Caesar's intervention as, "Let us restore lawful order." They heard, "Everything you worked for might be undone by your exiled sister and a Roman with a sword." Which, to be fair, was basically accurate, because Caesar has done something extremely dangerous. He has made Cleopatra politically visible again, and visibility is power. If the people of Alexandria see that Caesar is taking her seriously, then Ptolemy's monopoly on legitimacy weakens. If officials see that Rome might support her, loyalties become flexible. If soldiers suspect the political future is changing, everyone suddenly discovers a deep personal commitment to whichever side looks more survivable. Ancient politics was not a loyalty program. It was musical chairs with swords, and Caesar had just changed the music. For Ptolemy's faction, there were only a few options. They could accept Caesar's arbitration, which meant accepting Cleopatra's return. Awful. They could negotiate, which meant admitting they did not fully control the situation. Disgusting. Or they could escalate, which, naturally, was the option with the highest chance of catastrophic consequences. So, of course, that is where everyone starts looking, because this is the Ptolemaic dynasty, and apparently nobody had discovered the peaceful meeting. And now we arrive at the moment when someone looks at a political disagreement and says, "Have we considered making this worse with soldiers?" Because apparently diplomacy was unavailable. Maybe it was on lunch break. Maybe someone misplaced it under all the murder plans. Either way, Ptolemy's faction had reached the advanced stage of crisis management known as make the problem louder. Enter Pothinus. Pothinus was one of the key figures behind Ptolemy XIII's faction, an advisor, a power broker, and apparently a man who looked at the phrase Roman military intervention and thought, interesting start, needs more stabbing. Because Caesar's involvement had created a very serious problem for Ptolemy's side. And when your palace strategy begins to collapse, you have two choices. You can adapt, or you can panic so aggressively that future historians have to give your panic its own chapter. Pothinus chose the second option, because why merely lose control when you can lose control with pageantry, naturally? Now, Ptolemy's faction did have one major advantage. They were not helpless. They had connections, they had influence, and outside the palace, they had access to something Caesar could not simply ignore: Egyptian military force. Which is always comforting when your legal argument is weak, but your commitment to bad decisions is strong. That brings us to Achilles. Achilles was the commander of Ptolemy's forces. So while Caesar was trying to impose his version of order inside Alexandria, Ptolemy's faction began turning to Achilles. Because if Caesar was going to interfere politically, then the answer, apparently, was to confront him militarily. Which is a fascinating decision. Not good, but fascinating. Because this was Julius Caesar, not a confused merchant, not a lost Roman tourist asking where the lighthouse is, not some guy who accidentally walked into a civil war because the signage was bad. This was Caesar. This was the man currently dominating Roman politics through a combination of military genius, terrifying confidence. The man had basically turned winning dangerous conflicts into a personality trait. And Pothinus looked at him and thought, yes, let's make him our enemy. Incredible. A decision so bold it almost disguises the fact that it is stupid. Almost. The logic from Ptolemy's side was simple. If Caesar supports Cleopatra, Caesar becomes the obstacle. If Caesar becomes the obstacle, Caesar must be pressured. If pressure does not work, surround Caesar. If surrounding Caesar creates a war with Rome, well, that sounds like a problem for tomorrow's committee. Ancient planning. Elegant as ever. Except for the minor issue that plans involving Julius Caesar had a long and distinguished history of becoming other people's obituaries. The conflict moved from whispers to messages. Messages became orders. Orders became movement. And movement became that lovely historical phrase, "The army is coming," which is rarely the beginning of a calm chapter. It is a military crisis. And Ptolemy XIII's court stops being merely dysfunctional. It becomes operationally suicidal. Which, to be fair, is a kind of progress. Not the good kind, but progress. Now, let's appreciate the strategic brilliance for a second. Ptolemy's advisors had a Roman general inside Alexandria, a Roman general with soldiers, a Roman general who had already shown he was willing to intervene, a Roman general who had spent years winning wars against people who also thought they had a plan. And their response was essentially, "What if we surround him?" Wonderful. An elite-level tutorial in how to transform an uncomfortable diplomatic situation into a military emergency before lunch. And Caesar understood the danger quickly, because despite all his confidence, Caesar was not invincible. He was in Alexandria with limited forces. He was far from his strongest support. The city was hostile. The Egyptian army was much larger than the Roman force immediately available to him. The palace quarter could be cut off. Suddenly, the great Julius Caesar, conqueror, general, political hurricane, man who treated other people's borders like polite suggestions, could find himself trapped. Which is a beautiful reminder that even the most powerful man in the room has a problem when the room has no exits. So when once the Egyptian army was involved and Caesar was holding the palace quarter, this was no longer just royal drama. It was urban conflict. And urban conflict is always delightful if your definition of delightful includes blocked streets, unstable crowds, armed factions, and the constant possibility that your safe route has just become someone else's ambush. For Caesar, Alexandria was dangerous not just because of the people. It was dangerous because of the geography. The palace mattered, the harbor mattered, the ships mattered, access to the sea mattered, supplies mattered, escape mattered, which is annoying because Caesar was very good at many things, but even Caesar could not simply command the Mediterranean to stop being strategically important. The harbor was not decoration. It was survival. If Caesar controlled access to the harbor, he had a chance. If he lost it, he could be cut off. And being cut off inside a hostile city is one of those situations military commanders generally try to avoid. Alexandria was becoming louder, hotter, more dangerous. Pothinus and Achilles did not calm the situation. They did not negotiate it. They took a fragile crisis, dipped it in oil, handed it a torch, and said, "Let's see what happens." But when your survival plan accidentally traps Julius Caesar in a hostile city, you have not solved the crisis. You have upgraded the subscription. This is ancient Egypt under the Ptolemies. Up to this point, Caesar has looked like the most powerful person in the room. The man did not walk into political situations. He invaded them emotionally. He had defeated rivals, commanded armies, terrified senates, crossed boundaries, political, legal, geographical, and probably several conversational ones. He was not the kind of man people casually ignored. But now, the palace was becoming a trap, and suddenly, Caesar's confidence had to deal with something very inconvenient: geography. There is nothing quite like geography to ruin a man's dramatic self-image, because ambition is lovely, but if the doors are blocked, the harbor is contested, the streets are hostile, and the local army is outside asking aggressive questions, your resume becomes less important than your escape route. And Caesar, Rome's great problem solver, was now part of the problem. Not supervising it, very inconveniently. He was trapped in the very crisis he had decided to manage, which is the ancient equivalent of opening a suspicious email and accidentally downloading a civil war. History loves to present men like Caesar as if they were carved from marble, fed on destiny, and immune to consequences. But in Alexandria, Caesar was vulnerable. He had authority, yes, but authority becomes slightly less impressive when the people outside your building have weapons and strong feelings. He had Roman prestige, yes, but Roman prestige does not automatically open a blocked street. Prestige is not a ladder. Prestige cannot row a ship. Prestige does not politely ask an angry army to come back later. So Caesar had to hold position. He had to secure the palace area. He had to protect access to the harbor. He had to keep his men supplied. And the small administrative inconvenience of not dying. A busy week. really makes you appreciate calendars. And somewhere in the middle of all this stood Cleopatra, because her gamble had worked. Cleopatra needed access. She got access. She needed Caesar's attention. She got Caesar's attention. She needed to force herself back into the political conversation after being pushed out by Ptolemy's faction. She did that too. A clean victory, for about 12 seconds. But the moment Cleopatra re-entered the center of power, the entire Egyptian crisis began reacting like someone had kicked a hornet nest and then tried to organize the hornets into a committee. This is the part of the comeback plan nobody puts on the motivational poster. And because this story was apparently worried it was becoming too simple, now we need to add another sibling. Of course we do. Because in the Ptolemaic dynasty, a political crisis was not truly complete until every available family member had wandered into the fire carrying a personal claim to the throne. We already have Cleopatra. We already have Ptolemy XIII. We already have Caesar trapped in Alexandria. We already have Pothinus, Achilles, angry factions, a hostile city, contested harbor access, and enough bad judgment to make the palace furniture file a complaint. So naturally, history looks at this situation and says, needs more royal claimants. Enter Arsinoe. Arsinoe IV was Cleopatra's younger sister. Because yes, Cleopatra had another sibling available. Terrific. Exactly what this crisis needed. A spare dynastic problem. Now, Arsinoe was not just some background princess quietly waiting for the family disaster to end so she could return to normal royal activities, like surviving breakfast and avoiding relatives. No, Arsinoe became politically useful. And in a civil war, politically useful is one of the most dangerous things a royal person can be. Because once Ptolemy's side and the anti-Caesar forces needed a symbol, Arsinoe could become one. Another royal name. Another legitimate face. Another alternative to Cleopatra. Another way to say, we are not just fighting Caesar, we are fighting for Egypt under a different royal banner. Which is a much better slogan than, we panicked because Cleopatra got back into the room and now everything is on fire. Less honest, but better branding. Arsinoe's entrance changes the shape of the conflict, because until now, the crisis could be framed fairly simply. Cleopatra versus Ptolemy XIII, sister versus brother, exiled queen versus child king and his advisors. Already terrible, already unstable, already the kind of family situation that makes ordinary sibling rivalry look like a board game night. But with Arsinoe involved, the conflict becomes even messier. Because apparently Egypt's monarchy looked at a two-way civil war and thought, can we make this a triangle? And yes, they could. This is where you have to admire the Ptolemies. Not morally, never morally, but structurally. Their ability to add complications to an already collapsing situation was almost artistic. Some families passed down jewelry. Some families passed down recipes. The Ptolemies passed down the sacred tradition of making succession disputes worse than medically recommended. Family. The gift that keeps trying to kill you. Which, in normal politics, would be a complication. In Ptolemaic politics, it was Tuesday with extra knives. Now there were more players, more claims, more factions, more ways for everything to go wrong. This is not a political crisis anymore. This is a royal disaster buffet. Everyone brought something. Ptolemy brought wounded pride. Pothinus brought manipulation. Achilles brought soldiers. Arsinoe brought another claim to the throne. Caesar brought Roman intervention. And Cleopatra brought the one thing her enemies were trying hardest to prevent, herself. Cleopatra's gamble had changed everything, but it had not solved everything. She had won access. She had not won Egypt. She had won Caesar's attention. She had not won Alexandria. She had gained a powerful ally. She had not gained safety. And Cleopatra's entire future is now attached to whether this isolated Roman general can survive the consequences of supporting her. That is why the secret meeting matters. Not because it was romantic. It matters because the meeting created a chain reaction. Access became recognition. Recognition became intervention. Intervention became resistance. Resistance became siege. And the siege became war. So by this point, the situation is no longer, will Cleopatra return to power? The question is much darker. Can Cleopatra survive the war her return has helped ignite? Can Caesar survive being trapped inside Alexandria? Can Ptolemy's faction force Rome out? Can Arsinoe turn herself into the anti-Cleopatra banner? And can anyone in this dynasty make one decision that does not immediately require soldiers? The answer to that last question appears to be no. A firm no. A historically documented no. So tell me in the comments, was Cleopatra a genius for choosing Caesar? Or did she just pick the least terrible option in a palace where every other option came with betrayal, exile, or a complimentary stabbing? I genuinely want to know what you think. And while you were down there performing the rare ancient ritual known as having an opinion on the internet, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and click the bell, because in the next episode, Caesar discovers that supervising Egypt's royal disaster is not a part-time job. The palace is surrounded, Alexandria is boiling, the harbor becomes a lifeline. Arsinoe is now in the game. Ptolemy's faction is still very committed to making everything worse. Terrible planning and absolutely no adult supervision.